I was 57 when my neighbor asked me the question, and it didn't sound like much at first. It was one of those afternoons where the day feels thin, like it could tear if you pull on it too hard. Late October, in a quiet subdivision outside Kansas City, the trees already past their best color. Leaves stuck in the gutters like old receipts you keep meaning to throw out. I was in the driveway with the hood of my car up, pretending I knew what I was looking at. Truth was, I'd been standing there more than working. I'd been doing that a lot lately, finding tasks that let me be alone without looking like I was trying to be alone. The neighbor from two houses down, Paul, walked over with his hands in his jacket pockets. Paul was in his early 60s, maybe. The kind of man who moved like he didn't want to take up extra space. We weren't friends exactly. We waved. We talked about weather. We borrowed tools once a year and always returned them too clean, as if scrubbing the metal could erase the fact you needed help. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, the polite distance where a person can still turn away without it being a thing. "You all right?" he asked. I gave the answer people give when they don't want their own life to become a topic. "Yeah, just the battery acting up." He nodded like he believed me, but his eyes went past the car, past my hands, past the little performance of normal. They me asked it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a question set down carefully between us, like a cup you could spill if you reach too fast. "Are you happy in there?" He didn't point, but his chin tipped toward my house, toward the front window where the curtains were half open, toward the place where my life was supposed to look complete from the street. For a second, I honestly didn't understand what he meant. Happy in there. Like the house was a job, or a cage, or a story you'd been reading so long you forgot you could close the book. I laughed once quick out of habit. What kind of question is that? Paul's face didn't change. He didn't smile back. He wasn't trying to be clever. He wasn't trying to pry. He looked tired in a familiar way, like someone who had sat through a lot of quiet dinners and finally started hearing the silence under the forks. "I'm not being smart," he said. "I'm just asking." I stared at the engine bay, all that clean plastic and bundled wiring, like it might offer something practical to do with my hands. My palms were suddenly too dry. My mouth felt dry too, like my body knew before my mind did that I was about to say something I couldn't take back. At 57, you start noticing the shape of your own time. Not in a panicked way, more like the way you notice the gas gauge. You don't feel fear first. You feel calculation. How far can I go like this? And I realized I didn't have a sentence ready for his question. Happiness is a big word. Too bright, too easy to argue with. If he'd asked, "Are you okay?" I could have said yes. If he'd asked, "Are things fine?" I could have said sure. But happy. Happy was something my wife Diane used to say when we were younger, when it still sounded like a plan. Happy meant vacations on credit cards and laughing at midnight for no reason. Happy meant choosing paint colors and believing that mattered. Now, happy felt like something people said on commercials. Something you were supposed to feel if you bought the right mattress. I looked up at Paul, and for a second I saw something in his face that I hadn't noticed before. A kind of careful attention, like he wasn't waiting for me to reassure him, like he would accept the truth if I handed it to him, even if it was ugly. The thing is, I didn't have a dramatic truth. I didn't have an affair, or a secret addiction, or a plan to run off. My life was respectable. My mortgage was paid down. My retirement account existed. I still went to work every day, still came home, still took the trash to the curb on Tuesdays. But inside the house, the air felt different than it used to. Not heavy exactly, just monitored. Diane and I had become efficient with each other. We knew how to keep the day moving without bumping into anything sharp. We talked about groceries, doctor appointments, bills. We talked around the things that used to matter, as if naming them would bring back the ache of wanting. And there were rules we never said out loud. Don't bring up the past. Don't talk about loneliness like it's real. Don't admit that sometimes you sit in the same room and feel like you're living with a coworker you respect but don't know. So when Paul asked me if I was happy in there, it was like he'd reached through the wall and touched a wire I'd been avoiding. I heard myself answer before I could stop it. "I don't know," I said. The words came out smaller than I expected. Not a confession, not a cry for help. Just an honest sentence. Paul nodded once, like that made sense. Then he asked the second question, softer, like he was stepping on to thin ice. "When's the last time you told her the truth about how you feel?" I felt my throat tighten. I could have gotten angry. That would have been easier. I could have said it wasn't his business, could have made it about boundaries and propriety. But the way he asked it didn't feel invasive. It felt human. Like he was asking because he'd been in the same room with himself at night too. Behind me, inside the house, I heard the faint sound of the television. Diane watched daytime programs with the volume low, like she didn't want the neighbors to know what filled the quiet. The curtains moved slightly with the heat turning on. Ordinary life, doing what it always did. I looked at my hands and noticed one of my knuckles was scraped, probably from earlier when I'd actually tried to tighten something. A small mark, nothing serious, but it stung in a way that felt symbolic, which annoyed me, because that's what happens at 57. You start turning everything into a sign. Paul didn't say anything else. He just waited, and in that waiting I felt something shift. Not in the world, in me. It wasn't courage. It wasn't clarity. It was a small, unwanted awareness that I'd been managing my life the way I managed that car battery, hoping if I ignored the failing part long enough, it would just keep starting. I finally looked up at the house again. The front door, the window, the place where my shoes sat lined up on the mat like a neat little lie. I didn't answer Paul's second question. Not yet. But the fact that he'd asked it meant I couldn't unhear it. And I knew that when I walked back inside, I wouldn't be walking into the same house I'd stepped out of. Because now there was a question sitting in the middle of the room, waiting for me to either name it or keep circling it until something broke. When Paul walked back toward his house, I stayed in my driveway longer than I needed to. The call didn't matter. The battery didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd put language to something I'd been keeping blurry on purpose. I lowered the hood like I was closing a file drawer, wiped my hands on a rag that was already stained, and stood there listening to the neighborhood settle into its usual rhythms. A dog barked 2 streets over. A lawn sprinkler clicked on somewhere it didn't need to. A delivery truck sighed at the curb and moved on. Ordinary noise, the kind that used to feel comforting. That day it felt like a cover story. I've lived in that house with Diane for 23 years. We moved in when the street still looked unfinished, when half the yards were raw dirt and the mailboxes were all identical and too shiny. Back then, we were still doing the hopeful version of ourselves. We hosted barbecues, We bought patio furniture we couldn't really afford. We talked about eventually finishing the basement, eventually taking the big trip out west, eventually slowing down. People talk about marriages like they break in half. Like there's a dramatic moment, a betrayal, a slammed door. Ours didn't do that. Ours thinned. It thinned the way a piece of fabric thins at the elbow. You don't notice day by day. You just reach for it one morning and realize you can almost see through it. In our early years, we were loud in the way young couples are loud. Not yelling, just present. Diane had opinions about everything, and I liked that. She used to stand in the kitchen with her hair still wet from the shower, coffee in her hand, and narrate the day as if it was a movie we were making together. I wasn't expressive the way she was, but I had steadiness. I showed up. I fixed things. I listened. I thought that was the same as intimacy. We had one son, Matt. He's grown now, living in another state with a job that sounds abstract when he describes it. He calls on Sundays if he remembers. Diane and I pretend we don't keep score. When Matt was little, our house was noisy in a different way. Legos underfoot, cereal bowls that never made it to the sink, cartoons playing at volumes that made you feel like your brain was vibrating. Parenting gave us a shared project. It also gave us a place to hide. I worked in facilities management for a big regional operation, nothing glamorous. Mostly keeping systems running, making sure lights stayed on, making sure the building didn't complain. I was good at it because I like problems that have edges. A leak, a faulty door, a schedule that needs adjusting. You do the work, you see the result. At home, things didn't have edges. Diane would say she was tired, and I'd nod like I understood. I'd say work was busy, and she'd nod like she understood. We were both speaking in weather. It wasn't that we didn't love each other, it was that love started behaving like a duty. You feed it, you water it, you keep it alive. But you don't sit with it anymore, you don't look at it too closely. Diane went through menopause a few years ago, and I remember thinking, at first, that it explained everything. The irritability, the insomnia, the way she'd stare at the pantry with the door open like she'd forgotten what food was. We talked about it in the practical way people talk about a medical change, doctor visits, vitamins, new pillows, a different thermostat setting, and then the symptoms eased, but the distance stayed. That's when I started noticing how much we avoided each other's eyes. It wasn't constant. We had good days. We laughed sometimes, usually at things other people did. We watched a couple shows together. We still ate dinner at the same table most nights. From the outside, we looked fine. In the neighborhood, fine is the highest compliment. But there was a tightness in the house that made me breathe differently. I'd come home and instinctively check her mood before I spoke, not because she was cruel, because I didn't want to add anything to her plate. And she did the same with me. We'd become careful. Careful can look a lot like love if you don't examine it. Paul's question landed because he'd seen me lately in a way most people didn't. Over the past year, I'd started lingering outside more, mowing the lawn slower, taking the trash out in 2 trips, standing in the garage like I was waiting for instructions. It's embarrassing to admit, but I think I was creating space because the house felt like it had invisible walls inside it. Not physical walls, emotional ones. Lines you weren't supposed to cross. Paul would be out sometimes too, washing his truck, sweeping his walkway. We'd exchange nods. Once last spring, he asked if I wanted a beer. I said no without thinking. Not because I didn't want a beer, but because accepting it felt like admitting I had time, and time felt dangerous. Time left room for questions. When Matt moved out, I expected it to be hard. It was, but not the way people said. It wasn't the empty bedroom that hit me. It was the empty conversations. Diane didn't have the daily purpose of him anymore, and I didn't have the excuse of being busy with fatherhood. We were left with ourselves. I'd tried to fill it with sensible things. I started walking in the mornings. I cut back on salt. I got my annual physical on time. I organized the garage. Those kinds of changes make you feel like you're steering something, even if it's just your cholesterol. Diane took up gardening again, but more methodically than before. She didn't get dirt under her nails the way she used to. She wore gloves. She kept everything neat. Sometimes she'd stand at the kitchen sink looking out at the beds with a face that made me wonder what she was thinking. But I didn't ask. Asking felt like it might start something neither of us knew how to finish. That afternoon, after Paul left, I finally went inside. The air smelled like whatever candle Diane had been burning, something clean and vaguely sweet, like the idea of laundry. She was in the living room, feet tucked under her on the couch, watching a talk show. Her hair was pulled back, reading glasses on, one hand absently rubbing her thumb against her ring like it was a worry stone. "Battery?" she asked without looking away from the screen. "Probably," I said. She nodded. The conversation concluded. I stood there for a moment too long, feeling how easy it would be to go upstairs, to do anything else, to keep living inside the safe parts of our life. Paul's voice came back to me, not as a challenge, but as a plain fact. "Are you happy in there? When's the last time you told her the truth about how you feel?" I looked at Diane's profile, the familiar slope of her nose, the small line between her brows that hadn't been there when we were young. I tried to imagine speaking honestly, not accusing her, not blaming her, just saying something real. My mouth opened, then closed again like I was testing a door that might be locked. And standing there, in the quiet between the television and the soft hum of the heating vent, I realized I couldn't even tell what the truth was without first deciding what I was willing to lose to say it. So I walked toward the kitchen instead, and I could feel the question following me through the house like a shadow I'd pretended wasn't mine. What was I actually afraid would happen if I finally told her? That night, I lay in bed and listened to Diane's breathing like it was a metronome for a life we kept time in. She fell asleep before I did, like she usually did. Not because she was careless, but because she had learned how to shut the day off. I stayed awake, staring at the faint glow of the alarm clock numbers. Midnight turns into 1 a.m., the way a small lie turns into a habit. Quietly, without ceremony. I kept replaying Paul's question, but the more I replayed it, the less it sounded like a question from him. It started sounding like something I'd been asking myself for years, just using other people's mouths to avoid owning it. At 57, you don't fantasize about starting over the way you might at 37. At 57, starting over looks less like freedom and more like paperwork. Lawyers, moving boxes, explaining things to your kid in a way that doesn't make you sound selfish. You picture empty rooms. You picture holidays. You picture your own face in a bathroom mirror you didn't choose. So the fear wasn't just losing Diane. The fear was finding out that even without her, I might not know how to be happy. In the morning, I got up early and made coffee. The kitchen was still dark, the window over the sink showing a slice of streetlight and wet pavement. I drank standing up, not because I had to, but because sitting felt like it would anchor me. Diane came down a little after 6. She wore her robe, hair still messy, and she looked older in the soft light in a way that made me feel protective and guilty at the same time. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She opened the fridge, stared inside like she was hoping the right answer might be on the top shelf, and then she poured herself orange juice. She leaned against the counter, sipping it slowly. Everything about her was familiar, and yet I felt like I was watching her from a slightly different angle. Like Paul's question had shifted the camera. I considered saying something right then. Something simple. Something like, "Can we talk later?" But the words stayed stuck. Not because I didn't care, because I did. And because I could feel how fragile our routine was. Routine was the scaffolding holding up the whole structure. The smallest honest sentence could knock it sideways. So instead I said, "I'll pick up a battery after work." Diane nodded, relieved by the practicality. She liked things you could fix. I went to work and did my job. I walked through hallways that smelled like cleaning solution and carpet glue. I signed off on a maintenance schedule. I listened to a younger guy complain about his supervisor. I nodded in the right places. I answered emails. I held a door open for someone carrying a cart of paper. All day, I felt like I was wearing my life like a jacket that didn't fit right anymore. On my lunch break, I sat in my car and didn't turn the radio on. I just sat there in the parking lot, looking at the steering wheel, trying to name what I actually felt. Lonely was the obvious one. But lonely wasn't precise enough. Lonely makes it sound like there's nobody around. Diane was around. She was in every room. It was a loneliness with company. Then I thought, unseen. That was closer. Unseen, not in a dramatic way, but in the way a person can be reduced to a set of functions. Husband, provider, co-owner of chores. The man who changes the air filter and pays the insurance. I realized I'd been doing the same to her, too. Seeing her as the woman who keeps the house steady, who remembers birthdays, who schedules dentist appointments, who makes sure the towels are washed. We had turned each other into roles, and then we'd wondered why the air felt thin. The internal choice was forming, and I didn't like it because it didn't offer a clean solution. Option 1 was to keep living the way we were living. Quiet, functional, emotionally underfed. It would probably last. We were good at lasting. We'd already proven that. Option 2 was to tell the truth, not as a weapon, but as a door. A door that could open to something better, or open to an ending. That's the part nobody tells you about honesty. It doesn't come with a guarantee. It's not a tool you use to fix things. Sometimes it's the thing that reveals what can't be fixed. After work, I drove past the auto parts store and kept going. I told myself it was because I was tired, because the traffic was bad, because I could do it tomorrow. But really, I wasn't ready to make the day different yet. Buying a battery was normal. Talking to Diane would not be. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot instead and sat there with the engine running. People walked in and out with bags. A couple argued quietly near their trunk. A woman laughed into her phone. Everyone looked busy with small decisions, like choosing apples, like picking a brand of cereal. I watched them and realized how little of my life lately had involved choice. Not big choices, daily ones. The kind that keep you from feeling like you're just being carried. I turned the engine off and sat in the quiet. In my head, I practiced a sentence. "Diane, I don't think I've been honest about how I've been feeling. It sounded dramatic. It sounded like the beginning of a fight. I tried a different one. I miss you, even when you're right next to me. That sounded pathetic, like a plea. I tried another. Are you happy? That felt like handing her the same weight Paul had handed me, except if she dropped it, it would land on both of us. I sat there a long time, rehearsing words, feeling the way each one could change the shape of our life. Eventually, I drove home without the battery. Diane was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables with precise, efficient movements. She glanced up. "Did you get it?" she asked. "No," I said, and, for the first time, I didn't rush to make an excuse. I let the no sit there. Diane's knife paused for half a second, then continued. "Okay," she said, too neutral. I hung my jacket on the chair instead of the hook, a small act of disorder that made my heart beat faster than it should have, and I realized my internal choice wasn't just whether to speak, it was whether I was willing to be slightly uncomfortable in my own home in exchange for the chance of being real again. I stood there in the doorway, watching her hands move, listening to the soft thud of the knife against the cutting board, and I understood that if I didn't choose something soon, life would choose for me. I cleared my throat. "Diane," I said. She didn't look up right away. "Yeah?" I could feel the moment narrowing, like a hallway getting tight. I had one chance to speak in a way that wasn't accusing, wasn't dramatic, wasn't a performance. And I still wasn't sure I deserved whatever came next. I said her name and felt something in my chest tighten, not from fear exactly, but from how unfamiliar it had become to start a sentence without already knowing how it would end. Diane kept chopping for a few more seconds. The knife hit the cutting board in a steady rhythm, like she was finishing a thought with her hands before she let her face join the conversation. Then she set the knife down, wiped her fingers on a paper towel, and finally looked at me. "What is it?" she asked. Her voice wasn't harsh. It was controlled. That's what made it harder. Controlled meant she'd already braced for something. I leaned a hip against the doorway, trying to look casual even though my palms were damp. "I didn't get the battery," I said again, like I was buying time with small facts. "I heard you," she said, then softer. "So, what is it?" The television wasn't on. The house felt unusually still, like it was listening too. I tried the sentence I'd practiced in the parking lot, but it came out different. "I don't think I've been doing a good job telling you where I'm at," I said. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, more like focus. She waited. She didn't rush to fill the space. She's always been good at that, even back when we were young. Silence didn't scare her. It just made her pay attention. I swallowed. "I've been feeling off," I said. She exhaled through her nose. Off how? That was the problem. The truth was a whole drawer full of things, and I was trying to hand her one item without spilling the rest. I looked at the countertop, the neat pile of chopped vegetables, the bowl set out for salad, ordinary preparations. A life built out of preparation. "I feel like we live next to each other," I said finally. "Not with each other." Diane's face didn't change much, but something in her shoulders shifted, like she'd been holding herself up with a muscle that just got tired. She turned back to the cutting board and began arranging the vegetables into a container. Not chopping anymore, just moving pieces from one place to another. It was something to do with her hands. "We're busy," she said. "I know," I answered. "But this isn't just busy." She put the lid on the container too firmly, a little snap of plastic that sounded like punctuation. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. That question could have been defensive. In her mouth, it sounded more like exhaustion. I stood there feeling the old patterns come alive. The part of me that wants to make things easier, to smooth it over, to say, "Never mind, it's fine, forget I said anything." Instead, I said something smaller and more honest. "I want you to know I miss you," I said. "And I don't even know if that makes sense because you're right here." Diane's eyes flicked up to mine, and for a second I saw something raw pass through her expression. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to grief. Like she'd been carrying the same thing and didn't have language for it either. Then she looked away quickly as if she'd shown too much. "We're not kids anymore," she said. "I'm not asking to be kids," I said. "I'm asking, I don't know. I'm asking for something that feels like us again, or at least for the truth about whether that's even possible." She pulled the drawer open and closed it, looking for something that was already in her hand. That's when I realized she was stalling too. Diane sat down at the kitchen table, her robe pulled tighter around her like a boundary. She stared at a spot near the edge of the table, where the wood had a faint scratch from years ago. Matt did that with a toy car when he was little. Diane never let me sand it out. She said it reminded her that we were living here, not performing it. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. "I'm tired," she said. I nodded, but she held up a hand slightly, like she wanted me to listen without translating it into a simple explanation. "I don't mean tired like I need a nap," she said. "I mean tired like I've been carrying so much in my head for so long that I don't know how to set it down anymore." My throat tightened again. I took a chair across from her, not too close, not too far. The distance felt symbolic, which made me want to laugh and also made me want to cry, neither of which I did. "I thought you were mad at me," I admitted. Diane's mouth tightened into something that wasn't a smile. "I'm not mad," she said. "I'm disappointed in us, in how quiet it got." That landed in my chest like a weight, because it was so close to what I'd been feeling, but hearing it from her made it real, in a way my private thoughts never had. I said, "I don't know when it happened." "I do," she replied, and that surprised me. She stared at the scratch in the table again. "It happened when Matt left," she said. "Not the day he moved out, not the goodbye. It happened after, when the house got quiet and we just kept doing the motions, like if we kept moving we wouldn't feel the space." I let that settle. Then Diane said something that shifted everything again. Not because it was shocking, but because it explained the careful air in the house. "I stopped telling you things," she said. I blinked. "What things?" She swallowed, and her eyes stayed on the table. "Things that made me feel needy," she said. "Things that made me feel like I was asking too much. You were always steady, and I love that about you. But sometimes it felt like steadiness was all you had, like there wasn't room for my mess." I felt my face heat. My first instinct was to defend myself, to list the ways I'd shown up, the bills I'd paid, the repairs I'd done. The years I'd worked late, the vacations I'd planned, the loyalty. But even as the arguments rose up, I recognized them for what they were. I resume. And that's not what she needed. I took a slow breath. I didn't know, I said. I know you didn't, she said. That's the problem. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy with the simple fact that we were finally looking at something we'd been stepping around. In the weeks after that conversation, nothing magically improved. That's what people imagine, that the truth is a switch you flip. For us, the truth was more like turning on a light in a room you haven't cleaned in years. You see everything. Dust, clutter, old stains, and you have to decide what you can live with. Time passed in small, awkward steps. We started talking in short bursts, like two people learning a language they used to speak fluently. Sometimes we'd do okay. Sometimes we'd retreat back into habit. Diane would get quiet again, and I'd feel the old panic rise, the sense that I'd ruined what little peace we had. And here's the part I didn't expect. I began to notice how much of my life had been built around avoiding discomfort, not just with Diane, with everyone. I kept things smooth because I thought smooth was the same as safe. But smooth had cost me something. It had cost me presence. One Saturday, a couple weeks after that first kitchen conversation, I came home from the hardware store with the battery. I'd finally bought it. I carried it inside like it was a peace offering. Diane was in the living room reading. She looked up as I walked in. "Got it?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. Then I hesitated, and instead of going straight to the garage, I sat down on the chair across from her. Diane marked her page with a finger and waited. I could feel how easy it would be to keep this confined to practical fixes, to go back to being the man who solves problems with receipts and wrenches. But I didn't want that version of me anymore. So I said, "Can I tell you something without it turning into a whole thing?" Diane's eyes softened slightly. "Try," she said. And right then I understood that the real change Paul's question had sparked wasn't the conversation itself. It was the fact that I'd started choosing discomfort over numbness, even if I didn't know where it would lead. I sat on the chair across from Diane, holding the battery in my mind like it was still in my hands. The living room had that late morning light that makes dust visible. Sun on the carpet, a thin stripe across the coffee table, the kind of ordinary detail you only notice when you're paying attention. Diane's book was open in her lap, her finger still marking the page. She looked at me without impatience, but with a guarded kind of patience. Like she'd already learned that conversations can become storms without warning. "Can I tell you something without it turning into a whole thing?" I asked again, because sometimes repeating a sentence is the only way to make yourself stand behind it. Diane nodded once. "Try," she said. I could feel how easy it would be to back away, to pretend I meant something smaller. But the truth was, I didn't know how to go back to the old way. Not after Paul's question. Not after hearing Diane say she was disappointed in us. That sentence had sat with me like a stone in my pocket. "I think I've been hiding," I said. Diane blinked slowly. "From what?" "From feeling anything too strongly," I said. "From you seeing me not have it together." She didn't interrupt. She just waited. That waiting, from her, felt like a gift I hadn't earned. I kept going before I could stop myself. "I've been acting like if I keep things calm, we'll be okay." Like calm is the same as good, I said. But calm has turned into distance. And I didn't mean for that to happen. Diane's jaw tightened, then loosened. She looked down at her book and closed it, not dramatically, just decisively, like she was putting something away to make room for what mattered. I didn't mean for it either, she said. But I got tired of trying to pull something out of you that you weren't offering. That hit a nerve because it was accurate, not cruel, accurate. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and stared at my hands. My hands are the part of me that always knew what to do. Fix the sink, tighten the bolt, carry the groceries, hold the ladder. But they couldn't fix what was happening between us. I've been scared, I admitted. Diane's voice softened a fraction. Of what? I thought about all the versions of fear, fear of divorce, fear of being alone, fear of embarrassment. But underneath those, there was something smaller and more humiliating. I've been scared that if we really talk, I said, we'll find out we don't have anything left, and that it'll be my fault, because I let it get this quiet. Diane's eyes stayed on me, not accusing, not forgiving, just there. I've had the same fear, she said. Only mine was that we'd go on like this forever. We sat with that. No music, no television, just the low sound of the refrigerator cycling on, the house breathing around us. After a while, Diane stood up and walked to the window. She didn't look outside at first. She looked at her reflection in the glass, like she was checking the face she'd been wearing. I don't want to start over, she said. Not like people talk about it. I don't want to blow everything up. I don't either, I said quickly. She turned toward me. But I also don't want to keep living like we're roommates who share a past, she said. I want to feel like I'm actually in my own life. That was the sentence that did it. Because it wasn't about me being a bad husband. It wasn't about her being ungrateful. It wasn't a blame sentence. It was a longing sentence. And longing is harder to argue with than anger. I nodded slowly. Me too, I said. Diane walked back to the couch and sat, leaving space between us at first the way we'd gotten used to. Then she shifted a little closer, not as a grand gesture, just as a decision. What do we do? She asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It wasn't a trap. It was the kind of question that comes after you finally admit you're lost. I took a breath. I tried to keep my voice steady, because steadiness is my reflex, but I didn't want to hide inside it. I think we start with small truths, I said. Not the kind that are meant to win, just the kind that are meant to be real. Diane's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She's never been a dramatic crier. She's a swallow-it-back person. But her voice changed, like something inside her loosened. I miss you, she said, and the simplicity of it made my throat burn. I nodded, because if I tried to speak right then, I wasn't sure what would come out. I miss you too, I said finally, and I'm sorry I made you feel like your mess didn't have a place with me. Diane looked down at her hands, then back up. I'm sorry I stopped trying, she said. I thought I was protecting myself, but I think I was just disappearing. That word sat between us. Disappearing. It made me think of all the evenings we'd spent in the same room, not touching, not talking, each of us shrinking so the other wouldn't have to deal with our needs. I realized how quietly you can leave a marriage without ever packing a bag. After that day, things didn't turn into a romantic montage. We didn't suddenly start dancing in the kitchen. We didn't renew vows. We didn't reinvent ourselves. What changed was smaller, and maybe more important. We began to notice the moments when we were about to retreat. Sometimes Diane would start to get quiet, and instead of letting her go there alone, I'd say, "Where did you just go?" Sometimes I'd feel myself smoothing things over, and I'd stop and say, "I'm doing that thing again. I'm trying to make this easier instead of truer." We went on a few walks after dinner, slow ones, the kind where you don't walk to exercise. You walk because it's harder to avoid each other when you're moving side by side under open sky. One evening, maybe a month later, we were sitting at the table and Diane asked me, "Do you want to stay married?" It was a blunt question, but it didn't feel violent. It felt honest. I looked at her and realized how much I wanted to say yes, not because it was the safe answer, but because I still recognized her. Under the routines, under the tiredness, under the years of being careful, I still recognized her. "Yes," I said, "but I want to stay married in a way that doesn't erase both of us." Diane nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then we keep doing this, even when it's uncomfortable." And here's the part that I think about whenever I remember Paul standing at the edge of my driveway. Everything didn't change all at once. What changed was that I stopped treating my life like something that was already decided. I saw Paul again a few weeks later, out by his mailbox. We nodded like we always did. He started to walk past, and I almost let him, almost kept it in the safe zone. But then I said, "Hey." He turned. I didn't tell him the details. I didn't turn my marriage into neighborhood conversation. I just said, "That question you asked me, it stuck." Paul held my gaze and gave a small nod, like he understood the weight of that. "Good," he said. Then he looked down the street and back at me. "You doing all right?" he asked. This time in the way people ask when they're willing to hear the real answer. I took a breath. "I'm doing more honest," I said. Paul's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more like relief. "Yeah," he said, "that's the hard part." He walked away, and I stood there for a moment longer looking at my house. Not as a cage, not as a performance, not as a place that owed me happiness, just a place where I still had time to show up. At 57, you don't get infinite chances, but you do get choices. And dignity at this stage of life looks a lot like finally telling the truth in a voice calm enough to live with.